I can right click and it'll cancel. Also, hold on one sec while I turn it on. Screencast keys are your tutorial benefits. So now you should be able to see the hotkeys as I use them. You can see that as I've grabbed it, all the numbers in its location have changed to map its new position. You can also change these manually by just clicking in this field and typing 000. Or at any given time, for location, scale, and rotate, you can clear out a transform by using Alt plus whatever the hotkey is. So for grab, it's G to grab it, and to clear it out, it's Alt G. One thing that's really, really great about this is that it's a lazy mouse. So when I hit it, I just move it around, and it just floats in space. And I don't know if I'm basing my assumptions on 4-year-old biased information about Maya, but back in the day when I was a Maya user, you would have to move things using the arrows, and 8 hours of clicking in a day like this would really, really, really hurt your hand. So lazy mouse is awesome. So when you hit G and it just floats in space, that's really, really good. But the problem is, you're not getting specific movement. You can add qualifying keys to grab, scale, or rotate to change that into something more precise. So for instance, down here in the corner, you see this little widget, which is your X, Y, and Z. Your Z is up, your X is side to side, and Y is straight forward and back. And by after hitting G, hitting X, Y, or Z, you can specify one of those axes. So if I wanted to move just on the Y axis, I could hit Y, and now the cube is moving forward and backward. Similarly, I can, instead of having this crazy number like negative 10.82987, I can type in a number that's really nice and clean. So I can just type in now 10. And at this point, the only thing left to do, you can see by the line that we're still in grab mode as a tool. The last thing to do is make it execute. So I can either hit enter to say I'm done, or I can hit escape to cancel, or, as I previously mentioned, left click is execute and right click is cancel. So I'm going to left click, and now it's going to be placed there. 0, 10, 0. Nice and clean. And once again, I can clear that out by hitting Alt G. The other nice thing about adding qualifiers to this is I can say everything except. So I could say grab, and let's say this is a building sitting on the ground, and I just don't know where the building is, but I do know that I don't want it floating into space or collapsing into the ground. So I could hit Shift Z, and now it's going to say everything except the Z axis. As you can see, Z is staying 0. There's one last thing, which I'm going to skip ahead and show you rotation. If I hit R, I can rotate, just so I can show this. The last thing to know about how you're translating things is if I hit G and Y, I can move it along the Y-axis. But let's say I wanted this cube to be flying in the direction it's pointing. I can set it to local axis by hitting Y a second time. So now it's flying in the Y-axis that's native to this. Does that make sense? Speaking of rotation, how did we rotate? The rotation hotkey is R. And if I hit R, we once again get a lazy mouse option of rotation. This is turntable rotation, meaning it's turning around in the screen as though it was facing the camera. The nice thing about this is we can still add hotkey qualifiers. So for instance, let's say I just want to turn this building around its base. I can hit Shift Z once again, and now here we are. Or I could say rotate Z, and then I can actually once again type in a number, 45, and now it's directly a diamond pattern, directly diagonal. Everyone following so far? Were you new users up there? The other nice thing about rotation, also note that I used Alt-R to clear it out. The other nice thing is that, let's say you don't want this to rotate in a turntable fashion. There's also trackball rotation, which you can get by hitting R a second time. So this will make it move like a joystick, where it's essentially pointing at where your cursor is. So that's rotation. Rotation's really good. Lastly, you have scale. You'll notice that in your transforms, scale is not 0, 0, 0, it's 1, 1, 1. And that's because it's a multiplicative effect. So if you imagine you're 6 feet tall, if you were to times yourself, if you were to multiply your height by 1, you would still be 6 feet tall. If you were to multiply your height by 0, you'd be shrunk down into a black hole of oblivion. So when you scale something, and then you hit Alt-S to clear it, it goes back to 1, 1, 1. And similarly, you just have to think about it in a multiplicative way. So if we want this to be thinner on the x-axis, we would say scale x, and then we could type in 0.5 to multiply it by 0.5 to lessen it. And all the other things, like the other ones, work here as well. So for instance, if it's rotated, we can scale on the y-axis of the local object, as opposed to scale on y in the global. And we can also scale on everything except the z-axis, or everything except the x-axis. And we can execute with left click, and we can cancel with right click. And we can clear with Alt-S. So those are your basic transforms. You got you got grab, scale, rotate, G, S, and R. You've got execute, left mouse button, cancel, R and B, and you can also use Alt plus transkey to clear. And then you can also add X, Y, or Z, and you can also add number. So that's basically the main ways you're ever going to use transform, scale, and rotate. Make sense? A little bit? A little bit lost?
Only halfway.
Go back to your Tai Chi. Share.
Question.
Yes?
When you were using the number pad, were those commands showing up in the left corner like the...
No, I just added that. So when we are navigating how we're looking, if I hit 7, that's top. If I hit 5, that switches between ortho and perspective. 1 is front, and 3 is side. And then control for the opposites. Yeah, control to do the opposite. Then plus or minus to zoom in and out. And number pad period to zoom in. Oh, and there's one other one. We have this object over here, which is our camera. You can move it about, but one thing to note is you can look through it with 0. So 0 is your camera view. And when you hit F12 to render, it's going to render from that camera shot. I like to oftentimes grab scale and rotate it while I'm looking through it. That's one way you can do it. The best way to navigate your camera is turn on lock camera to view. And that's going to make your camera behave as if it's subject to your basic transform movements.
What was that? The lock camera to view?
It's on the properties panel with your camera selected. I don't know if you did the camera select. It's under view, lock camera to view. So basically you want to turn it on, and then you can just zoom around to where you want to look. And the big important thing to know is that when you're done, click it off. Because otherwise you will get into the perfect view and then say, I wonder what this looks like, and you ruin all your work. Don't do it with auto key.
Unless you want that.
Worst timeline ever.
Make sure to change frames on one.
Remember, you can always press shift left arrow.
Let's turn on lock camera to view. Auto key turned on. Then hit play and start zooming around. Oh, it's not doing it. Maybe I need to have a keyframe start. Nope. Okay, that's good news, I guess. Alright. Turning off lock camera view. So we've got our 3 basic transforms. We got our 3 UNAVs. What else do we need? We've got our 3 mouse buttons. Left click, which we're ignoring for now. Middle click, which lets us zoom around. And right click, which selects object. Right click to select objects also has some qualifiers. You can hold shift to add to selection. You can also hold shift to cancel from selection. And then beyond that, there's a few other selection tools that are good to know from this starting thing. One is that you can hit B for a box or border marquee. So if I hit B, we get the dancing ants. We can drag that and select multiple objects. You can also hit B and hold middle mouse, cancel. So a lot of tools. Blender is very interesting in that oftentimes you're using a tool and then you go into a subtool. So for instance, when I hit B, we're in the box tool mode. If I use left click, it's going to select and execute. If I use middle mouse, it's going to deselect. And if I hit B and then just right click, it's going to cancel.
Doesn't shift or alt do the same thing as the mouse in that case as well? Yeah,
I think it did back in the day. I remember being mad about that. Hey, change it back.
What? Should I go back? Everything. Okay.
Regress the
I'm on
keynote
it.
to 249.
Well, that's a bad idea. Yeah, we need the gestures back because those are like you can get it in 3 tries usually. Gestures.
I remember a song at one point being like it was talking close for
What do you
movement.
need?
He was saying like this is like
So what else?
certainly making my head like ouch.
I used to use this a lot.
There's also other selection tools while we're on the concept of right click.
Arrows.
The A key selects and deselects all. I think a lot of Maya users, the first thing they do is they start Blender and they get really, really angry because the key was selected. And they want to not have anything selected, so they start right clicking into space, thinking that deselects. There's also, this is my favorite, is you can lasso select by using Control left mouse button. And I would actually have this set as my default left mouse button, I think. But so if I hold Control, I can select objects. I can also, I think I can Control Shift deselect. Yeah. So Control left mouse button, lasso around things. Control Shift left mouse button, deselect. So let's go into edit mode where we're going to see selection tools used a lot more, and we're going to see another rule of threes component, which is the 3 basic components of a mesh object. Mesh components. So the first one is going to, first off, how do you get into edit mode? The way that you should learn first is by using this pull down menu, which is how you can change modes on something. You'll notice that I have the 3D cube selected, and I'm going to hit this and go to edit mode. The other hotkey way to do this is with tab, which switches between edit mode and object mode. Within edit mode, we have three component types, which are vertex, edge, and face. We can change this using these buttons down here. So, for instance, here we are on face mode, and you'll notice that now the faces have this little tiny dot in the center of them to select them from. When we're in vertex mode, we have these dots appear on the corner where things match up. And when we're in edge mode, we can select edges. I'm selecting them using the same selection tool from previously, which is left mouse button. And some of those other selection tools that I just mentioned are also available. So for instance, hitting A toggles between select all and select none. Hitting B, border selects. Hitting Control and left mouse button, lasso selects. Control Shift, lasso select, deselects. Or Control Shift, left mouse button. So a lot of the hotkeys from one mode to another will transfer across Blender, even into really obscure windows.
Seabug.
Yeah. Also, one thing to know is if you want to delete something, you could use the delete key, but Blender actually lets you do it with the X key, which I prefer because it's closer to where you want your hand to always be in Blender, which is Control, Alt, and Shift, and therefore it's a little faster.
Take that one.
One thing you might have done by accident, which I just did on purpose, is if you hit Z, you can toggle between wireframe and shaded mode. And this is also a mode that you want to first learn by the pull-down menu. So if you go to the 3D views header, which is ironically on the foot, you can see the viewport's shading options, which are next to the modes. So wireframe and solid are what you switch between with Z. We're not really going to go into textured or bounding box. One thing that is worth noting for edit mode is how to view back faces. This is something that's really frustrating at first, because oftentimes you'll be like, I want to select all these vertices. So I'm going to hit B for border select, and I select them. There I am. I have all these selected. Well, no you don't, because you don't have backface culling turned on. So this face back here was basically obscured by these faces,
you
and therefore not
do
selected.
have back face pulling.
All right, I have the opposite. It's got bad terminology.
No, it makes sense.
I think it should be called enable see-through mode or not.
It's a technical term.
So if you continue along the 3D header, there's a button here, which is limit selection to visible, which you can turn on or off. And now, so if I do this again with that button turned off, now I'm going to select that face in the back. So I usually like to have this off. The one exception is when you're dealing with a gigantic sculpted mesh with like 2 million verts, because then oftentimes it's very, very frustrating to select when you can see the face that's behind it, because there's too much detail on the screen and therefore you're not really processing it. Let's do a really awesome lasso technique, which will select everything except this vert. So, wait, I already missed that.
No, you have it.
Wait, I did it. Hooray! Everything except that one.
You can also invert your selection.
Right. So going back to the three basic components of a 3D mesh, I was switching between vertex, edge, and face using these buttons down here on the 3D header. However, there's a hotkey for it, which I vastly prefer. I always love hotkeys, which is Control Tab. Control Tab brings up a menu, and I can select vertex, edge, and face. Very similar to many alt menus in other programs. You can then type the key of the underlined thing. So I can type E to select edge mode, since E on edge is underlined. Or I can also in Blender type the numerical order of that shelf. So I could select face mode by hitting Control Tab to bring this menu up, and hitting 3 because face is the third option. Or you could just click it. So I hope you're playing around with this and selecting different verts, edges, and faces and seeing how they move around differently and scale and rotate.
Somehow I got into weight heat by hitting control.
That is something Nathan is definitely fixing, I believe. Nathan is currently working on the future key map for Blender.
Blender. That's super slow going.
It will ruin everything.
So what you probably did is you hit. It's this weird flowchart of if you hit Control Tab, if you hit Control Tab while in Edit mode, you bring up this menu. If you hit Tab, you go back to Object mode. If you hit Control Tab while in Object mode, you go to Vert mode. But you can still get into Edit mode. If you're lost, just click on the tool panel and go back to Object mode.
Like close a little.
Not ideal, but you know, when you're panicking, just stop using hotkeys. Is essentially the best solution. It's really frustrating because I want you to learn hotkeys, and the best way to get good at any program is, in my opinion, find the hotkey document and set it as your computer background.
What's nice about a lot of things in Blender, like if you hover over certain,
A lot of things in the menus will tell you the hotkeys. So for instance, here you can see face is Control F. Let's bring up the face menu.
it's about to me that rotate faces is no longer the default key.
At this point, I do want to talk about a workflow thing. I don't know if this is the best way, but it is something that I really try to push on newcomers because newcomers will often get super loud. Hey! How's it going? One thing that happens is, so let's say we have like, so let's say you have like this off and you're like, I want to select that face in the back. Let's go select it. Which one did I select? You're selecting between two verts that are right on top of each other, and there's lots of bad workflow stuff that you do. So what I like to pitch is this idea that you should use a 3-step workflow. Which is step 1, you're going to get the right view. 2 is select the right stuff. And 3 is do the right thing. So if you're new, you're often going to be like, oh, I want this thing to go over here. Let's start in the wrong view with the wrong selection, and you're suddenly frustrated when it doesn't work. So try and make sure that you go view, select, and then tool. So what are our view options? Well, we've covered that already. It's all through the middle mouse. You can control, you can pan, you can orbit, you can zoom in on something that's selected with period. You can use your number pad to change them. So I think we have view done. We've covered that really good. We've started talking about selecting tools. So for instance, control left mouse button is how we did the lasso select. That's one way you can select. Having backface culling on or off is going to change how you select things. So that's something that you might want to turn on or off to improve your selection abilities. And then lastly, border select is a good one. There's also grow selection and shrink selection. I'm going to subdivide this to show it better. So if I have this one vertex selected, I can grow the selection out with Control plus. I can also shrink selection with Control minus.
Does that work in face mode also, Oscar?
I believe so, unless you're trying to bluff me and something got changed. Oh look, it does work.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of good selecting tools, and knowing how all of them work is a great thing. You can even see here that their menu is literally set up to push my philosophy on you. View, select, tools. So get the proper view, look at all these tools to get in the proper view. Make the proper selection, here's all your selection options. And here's the things that you can do. There's a few other selection tools we're going to do before we get into that troublesome area of doing a thing. One is selecting an edge loop. So if you hold Alt, so if you click on a face, you will select that face. If you hit Alt and then click on a face, specifically on an edge, it will select a loop of those faces. This is very handy, as 3D mesh editing is very much about good edge loops. And so that's something that is a good habit to get into now. So, for instance, you can select all sorts of things. You can also add to selection using Alt-Shift, right mouse. Was I saying left mouse? I meant right mouse. And you can also deselect using. I don't know how to deselect it. Control? Oh yeah. I think it's just toggle. Yeah, so if this is selected and this is selected, I can just keep holding Alt, Shift, and left, Alt, Shift, and right mouse clicking to add or deselect edge loops. So for instance, I could then go over here and create an interesting inversion. What other select tools are good to know? Oh, similar is really good. I'm going to. What is it?
If you have edge loop selected using Control Shift, and if I was to click on this edge here, where I don't have any selection,
Yeah, so you want to
add to it. However,
if you select inside of the stuff that's already on, it'll say off.
the edge of part of my selection will deselect that portion.
Yeah. So if I were to say deselect stuff on this edge loop by clicking in the unselected stuff, it's going to add instead. But if I do it over here, it'll say, stop making me look bad. It'll say deselect. Ah. What else do we have? The select similar option is also really good. I'm going to duplicate this really fast. This is a tool. I'm skipping ahead to tools, but duplicate you can do with any sort of selection using Shift D. So I'm going to duplicate some of these out so we have something to work with. The select similar option is very, very good, especially when you're dealing with lots of complex stuff on your mesh. If you hold Shift G, you're going to bring up the select similar option. Let's actually even assign this to a separate material. I want to make a new material. Never mind that you have no idea what this is. Just trust that it can. So, if I have one face selected and I hit Shift G, I get the select similar. If I select by material, it will select only the things with the red material assigned. Similarly, if I select over here, I can select by material and it'll select the things with the gray material on it. There's lots and lots of good stuff in the select similar ones. I really enjoy using normal, but if you notice that these two cubes both are using the same normal. What a normal is you can argue that it's the fourth component in a way. I can turn normals on using the properties panel over here. Yay! There is a, by the way, who has the super job? Does anyone need this for Blender stuff?
I don't know, what is it?
It's got,
That's what he's showing.
it's got a folder called seabug on it. Copy it to the C drive. So a normal, I'm going to turn it on so you can visualize it. As you can imagine it as a perpendicular line pointing out from any given part of a face. This is a handy thing to know because, for instance, these faces are both pointing up, are all pointing up, and these faces are all pointing up. So when I select similar normal, it's going to select everything that's pointing up essentially. And if you've noticed, you have this tool panel over here. Anytime you use one of these tools, you actually get a bunch of options. So for instance, I can increase the threshold until I start selecting other things. But let's say I don't want it to do that. I want only the ones on this cube because I want a sort of trellised effect. Not trellised, terraced effect. So if I select normal with 0 as the threshold, it'll select both, and I could just deselect from here. But instead, what I'm going to use is coplanar. So what that'll do is it'll say what's facing the same normal but at the same global z axis in a way. Very handy. I think all of these I've used at one point.
It actually uses the normal as the axis.
Huh?
It uses the normal as the axis.
Wherever that is. Yeah, something like that. I don't know. You're the normal guy. So those are some selection tools that are really good to know. A few others. Oh yeah, linked is the other one. Here we have these two meshes. They're part of the same object, but they are two separate chunks of mesh. So the linked tool is very handy because it says select everything that's a connected part of this mesh. So if I'm hovering my mouse cursor over this chunk and I hit L, it will select linked. That's very handy if you have, for instance, a head with eyeballs and you just want to select the eyeballs, which, yeah,
Happens a lot more than you think.
yeah, pretty much every time you use Suzanne.
Are you talking about your child?
I had a baby, by the way. Hooray, Oscar.